What if the single biggest roadblock to your automation initiatives wasn't a complex technical hurdle, but something far more fundamental, like not knowing exactly what IT you even have? Organizations are racing to automate, promising faster deployments and fewer errors, but many are hitting a wall. They lack a unified, reliable view of their own infrastructure. In WWT's new Automation Priorities for 2025 research paper, establishing a robust source of truth stands out as priority number one for a very critical reason. You can't automate what you don't know. Today, we're diving into this foundational priority with Nick Thompson, Distinguished Solutions Architect from Worldwide Technology, to understand why this seemingly simple step can either make or break your entire automation strategy. I'm Rob Boyd, and this is WWT Presents Research.
WWT Presents Research.
And what is the struggle from an automation perspective that you're kind of seeing play out across your experiences at this point? Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Just a kind of quick reintroduction for you and for everybody else. Nick Thompson, I'm a Distinguished Solutions Architect with our automation practice, part of our Global Solutions and Architectures organization. So in this role, I have the ability of working with all of our customers across all verticals, all sizes, on helping them solve challenges as it relates to primarily infrastructure automation, but really kind of all things automation as a whole, and really kind of being that go-to resource for them as we help them move forward in that space.
Why would you say automation is still a struggle for many organizations? Surely everybody's automated by now, but it's probably not that simple, yeah?
Yeah, I think it is interesting I've been in this role now for coming up on 6 years, and we have a lot of conversations to this day that are very similar to what we were having 6 years ago. But I think the scope and scale is probably a little bit different now. Fundamentally, I think, where we look and where our clients are struggling is just building that enterprise grade capability across their organization. There's always pockets of automation. Every client has automation all over the place. If you start to look under the covers, every team is a lot of times doing things in their own way. There are, people on individual teams that don't even know their teams are automating, that are, going and doing things in an automated fashion. But I would say that, going forward now, there is this push, thankfully, from an organizational and enterprise kind of standpoint, to really drive towards delivering it as an enterprise capability and starting to change the way that people are building and delivering and operating the technology in their organization with that automation first kind of mentality finally.
Well, so being that we got a whole research report dedicated to this topic, and we're specifically going to be covering priority one today around source of truth as being something that perhaps is missing in a lot of attempts here. But even before that, I wonder just one more setup, and it's just, what are the benefits of automation? You make a good distinction there between, it's one thing for people like me and you perhaps that are always seeking to maybe improve processes on our own and be better about it. And I tend to think most people I work with are kind of like that. But that's really not the automation you're talking about here. You're talking about enterprise-wide, something that lifts all boats, so to speak, within the company. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the big thing when we look at, really all of our clients, so many organizations are being asked to do more with less. There's the demand and the, I would say, expectation that when they're, delivering technology or doing operational maintenance, whatever it may be, that it be done with a consistency and a, I would say, level of excellence where, outages aren't acceptable, right? Running into manual change causing, downstream problems due to lack of testing and things like that, they've been an issue in IT forever, right? But organizationally, this is starting to be one of those things where you have to drive forward and be able to do this in a manner where you can increase the consistency in which you can make change. You can reduce the risk in the change that you're making, and that you can also validate and prove from an infrastructure standpoint that your infrastructure is running in an expected state, right? That it is doing and behaving in the way that you expect of it at all times, because that really does drive that kind of end-to-end expectation that the business is getting what they need from IT systems are up and operational, and that, as a engineer in one of those organizations, whether, focused on the network or storage or compute or whatever it may be, that what they're delivering is the same experience all the time, and that people are getting what they expect from IT. I think probably the best way to maybe even boil that down is that public cloud, people have a really high view of public cloud of getting what they want when they want it, right? And that expectation in our clients is also that IT provides that same and similar experience of fulfilling a request in a timely manner and getting something to someone when they need it and when they want it. And automation is a key driver to that as well.
Why is this hard? Why have people, I would assume you've run into people that have attempted this and stopped short or got distracted and into other stuff. They just didn't quite pull it off because maybe they didn't start with the right understanding of what was in front of them and how to get going, maybe?
First and foremost, it's very hard to automate something that is not well documented. And when things aren't documented well, or they are not documented in a consistent manner in a common place, right? That really drives a lot of issues with how do I make sure that, everybody is working either on the same copy of data, or we have all of the data necessary to describe how a device should be in the infrastructure or what it's connected to or whatever it may be. So that kind of foundational step is these sources of truth help us build that picture of documentation first. And then once that documentation is in place, that's our central point where we can start to make sure that all of the data exists in one spot. Because fundamentally, to deliver automation at scale, we have to solve the data challenge, which is, where do we get the information that's describing the intended state of this infrastructure from a common source? The days of, 35 Excel spreadsheets and a Confluence doc over here and someone's Word doc and a, text file floating wherever it may be, that doesn't scale, right? And first and foremost, if we don't deliver that source of truth, that scalability becomes very hard to deliver.
When you say those days, is as if it's past tense, but that is currently the reality of a lot. I assume you still see this. Do you see many new things? People come up, I've graduated from an Excel spreadsheet to a Google Doc. Or,
we do. We've pulled data from a lot of very interesting places, and we still talk to clients that, they're updating spreadsheets. They've got 50 tabs in the bottom of an Excel workbook, and everything is inside of there. And I recently talked to a client that they still, on one of their teams, were using mail merge out of Excel to render configuration templates that they were pushing to devices. So we definitely see, from fully well-established, robust sources of truth in our clients to people still using Excel and mail merge, and, driving people towards that desired outcome is a lot of effort and a lot of data management that we have to go through to get it cleaned up and ready to go.
Well, I want to jump into the action steps for this common thing we do with every research show, because these are consistent, kind of a consistent structural format that we find with all the papers. There's only 3 action steps here, and I feel like what you were talking about starts to lead straight into one of the first things recommended here, which is selecting the right platform. And so I guess it goes without saying Excel is not the right platform. But what are the considerations for the platform when you're talking about systematizing this source of truth?
Yeah, I think, first and foremost, there's definitely, especially with our customer base and the size and scale of their infrastructure, having a platform that is capable of modeling just the large amount of data that our clients have from, having many data centers, hundreds or thousands of remote branch offices, even down at the branch or campus type of location, 10s or 20s of closets that may exist in those buildings full of network equipment. So being able to build that structure of what belongs in the tooling of just site and location data and where assets live, obviously first and foremost is one of those key pieces. Making sure that whatever platform they select has a robust API, because again, not only consuming the data from it to drive the automation that we want to implement, but also being able to keep it up to date. We're always making sure that devices are input into the source of truth. So if a client is deploying a new branch office or going through a technology refresh or whatever it may be, onboarding assets into the source of truth is generally an automated workflow as well. So having that API and that ability to integrate to other tools is extremely important. And then I think, on top of that, fundamentally, And, one of the things we always talk about as to why, Excel can get you to a point, if you will, it needs to be multi-user, right? It needs to have all of those things that a good multi-user system has, right? Role-based access control, audit logging, being able to see who made a change and when. Those are the things that when you look at an Excel sheet, they're not really primed to have a team of network operations people going in and working on the document at the same time. So, that's really important. And then I think fundamentally, the expectation that whatever platform is being deployed is wrapped with some level of enterprise support. This becomes key to, the core of the automation infrastructure and the documentation of the system as a whole. So having enterprise support so that as new versions are released, you've got a supported upgrade path, that you've got a, someone to call if there's an issue that arises with the system. And then also, being open, right? Having that ability to extend and leverage and, layer new features on as necessary based off of, pivoting changes, whatever it may be that come inside the environment that today we don't see, but, in 6 months, a year could be there. And, that openness is really important to be able to do that as well.
Is there a category name for this type of system? Because it just dawns on me that I'm not even sure what I would search for, or if it would just be a source of truth box. Not a box, this kind of thing, but what do you call it?
Network sources of truth, single sources of truth. For the most part, they're going to, if you were to search under that name, you'd find the market pieces that are there. But they also do a lot of other things too. And that's, I think, what can be confusing to clients as well, because fundamentally, data center infrastructure managers have existed for a very long time, right? Data center operations teams being able to track assets down to the floor tile and what rack lives there and the power consumption. There's a lot of overlap between these sources of truth and those tools as well, because the data in those tools is fundamental to, how we model the infrastructure as a whole on top of these tools as well. So there's definitely a little bit of market overlap there, and they may come up together depending on how you're searching. But I would say network source of truth, single source of truth are probably two of the most common terms.
Well, from a capability perspective, it sounds like you're not just ingesting the data and you need kind of the API level interaction with the tools that it needs to be able to automatically, run these workflows in and pull information from. But it sounds like when you talk about data center information managers or something, are you also looking for this tool to manage other tools in certain situations because that tool is specialized for that data center network architecture, to use that example?
Yeah, I would say, we kind of view them as they're kind of, in a way, they're the hub of everything, right? When this information is in one spot and it's in this central location, and I can add to it and consume it and have it in this kind of center of the universe as far as how we run and build the automation that's going to drive the technology. It really kind of lives in that middle ground where it can do a lot, and it can be extended to do a lot. I think we've always viewed from a WWT standpoint that these tools serve as that core data repository, right? Yeah. And there are tools on the market that do a lot and can layer on a lot of other features and functions kind of to that behavior. But what we found is that focusing on it as the piece in the middle that stores all of that data really sets up for long-term success, because then in the way we've generally approached automation and kind of having this modular architecture where, we may need to pull different things out, or you may introduce a new OEM down the line that does something differently. That's okay, because we can integrate those two tools and get that data where we need it, when we need it, versus have to rely on this one tool to drive everything end to end.
Yeah, I'm just taking an overly simplified personal example. I remember back in days of saying, I should have a work calendar that's different from my personal calendar. And then I began realizing that, well, wait, I still need one source of what is my day, because I'm still the same person trying to get this across. And one can't be updated at the sacrifice of another, in terms of determining availability, perhaps.
And then also
simplified, multiply that exponentially.
And then you run into those issues with data overlap too, right? If something is in this system or this system, what is the piece of data that matters, right? And so there is that process and that data reconciliation that we have to go through that says, this is my source of truth. I have another system out here that says something different. We should probably look at that issue and understand why they've deviated and correct that problem, right? Because we want we want to drive as much of a cohesive view of the data that it relates to the infrastructure as it can. And so that data cleanup, that data hygiene process is extremely important for the long-term success of it.
Well, there you go. Let's talk about the hygiene and the ingest. So you mentioned this as we were talking about step one, but now step two in this is data ingestion, or focusing on data ingestion and hygiene. What does that mean, hygiene, when it comes to your data, and what's important here?
First, when we look at the ingestion side of it, right, for an organization that doesn't have a source of truth, correlating and aggregating and getting all of this data into one spot and getting a cohesive view of what you have is can seem like a monumental task, right? It can at times, if you don't have one, seem like you're going to just come in and boil the ocean, so to speak, and be able to start to, it's kind of daunting, right? Thinking about how long it's going to take to do that. But fundamentally, as we start to break that down and consume data from, the different platforms and start to aggregate it and get it into this spot, that gets into that hygiene issue, which sets the stage both early on as we're building it out and then long-term as we're operating it, which is I need to make sure that, any data that I'm ingesting into the system is validated and correct, right? I don't want to automate my infrastructure with stale data. I don't want to I don't want to use incorrect data as the driver of how I'm building and deploying my automation. But then two, from a hygiene standpoint, I also want to make sure that if I have a feedback mechanism to go update another system of record, because mine is the correct view in this central tool, I can do that, right? I want to make sure that, a network operator may live in an OEM provided tool, to manage their data center fabric, for instance. We want the data that's in that tool to match what's in the source of truth, right? We want to be able to give whoever is looking at their infrastructure from their tool or their, dashboard of choice, whatever it may be, a common experience as to someone that's looking at the data that's actually driving it. Making sure that, our data is clean, both on ingest and throughout the entire life cycle, is extremely important, because we don't want that deviation between those two systems, because that's where we can start to introduce bigger long-term issues, right, of starting to either drive the infrastructure incorrectly as it relates to how we use the automation and what it's doing. But also operationally, if you have two teams with two different views of the same infrastructure, they may land on a different problem when they're trying to troubleshoot something common.
And so ideally, these things you're kind of, when you talk about hygiene, you're setting up the ability for these also to do this in real time, so that they're always synced, because that's really, you don't want to just say the rule is they have to be updated. So make sure you've successfully copied and pasted this every time you've made a change. That's not really a scalable solution that would reduce errors.
Yeah.
So, okay.
And I think it comes down to, in the source of truth, we're going to define what is the intended state of the infrastructure, right? So I expect it to look like this. Now, there's no guarantee it looks like that, right? So we have to have that reconciliation process at the end, whether we're going on configuration compliance runs or we're validating that an asset that's in here is actually still in the environment and, online and exists, right? We see a lot of organizations that decom a device and turn it off and never clean up any of the data behind it, right? So then now we have a picture of the environment that isn't true, right? Because a site may be decommed and gone, or three switches were collapsed into one during a refresh, and we've got leftover data that's out there. So having that life cycle behind the data that's in the source of truth, really sets the stage, I think, for a conversation that you'll have in the future from a priority 2 standpoint, but they really are linked together from, both the source of truth and how we manage the assets in the infrastructure as well.
Yeah. And I would assume maybe this is a normal part of the tool, but you want to make sure that your tool's gives you the ability to alert on these things, like deviations from a baseline. You're reminding me of like in software development, the notion of a golden image or something. And it's step one, right off the bat, you're saying we need to define what this stuff looks like. And so, but the system should play a part in helping us understand if those things start to drift, because a lot of things I feel like you're also hinting at aren't things that go, oh, it'll be a network failure. Well, it may not be a failure. It could be a something over time that makes it harder for you to recover in the event of a failure, perhaps, or trending in a way that's just less efficient and you're not using your resources correctly or making bad decisions, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's, when we talk about just some of the risks of not doing this correctly, right? One of those being that configuration drift and inconsistencies in the in the running state of the infrastructure versus the intended state. If we have a device that's had a bunch of, manual change made to it, for example, that hasn't been, recognized from a source of truth standpoint, and that device were to fail and someone were to go swap the device and then, rerun the automation to put it back into play, if that actual running state had never been reconciled coming back, when we go swap that device out, we now have inconsistency in the environment, right? That site's configuration does not match what it was before the failure. And then now we have to go through all of the steps again to troubleshoot and figure out, how did that configuration drift? Where is it supposed to be? One of the things we're always trying to do is reduce the risk of change inside the environment. And anytime you don't have good data, that risk increases. And, now we're getting more people involved. We've got, outages. We've got, 100 people on a bridge trying to figure out what's going on in the environment, when fundamentally, we could have probably caught that early on by, focusing some effort on making sure that our data was up to speed and our, configuration compliance was being checked on a regular basis. And we were acting on that drift and that inconsistency when it was found versus waiting to discover it at a later date.
Yeah, when it becomes a much bigger problem. Okay, so focus on the right platform and understand that's right for your needs from a scale, from a capability perspective. Data ingest and hygiene deserve focus as part of step 2. And then step 3, which is our final step, really uses the word operationalize your source of truth. Is that just a matter of turning it on, or is there some things we need to understand about?
Yeah, I think this is probably the biggest shift from an environmental standpoint. When we talk about how are we going to affect change going forward, right? And we just touched on it a little bit, but if a team gets a ticket to turn up a port in a closet somewhere on a switch, and they were to just very quickly log into that switch and change the configuration on that port, we now have drift from the source of truth, right? So we want to drive the behavior that when that port change needs to happen, what they aren't doing is going to the switch and making the change manually. They're updating the source of truth. The automation that's consuming that data is running to go provision that port. And then we've now not only described our intended state, but enforced it with automation, right? So that we can confirm that device itself is doing what we expect of it. And then longer term, it sets the stage where, it gives us that ability to drive self-service where, maybe we expose a workflow and a site contact can go to a service catalog and, pick a switch in the closet in their branch office and say, I want this port to have a printer plugged into it. And when they run that workflow, it's not talking to the switch, it's updating the source of truth. That source of truth data is then consumed and flows down, and, the automation
really
runs,
a service-oriented kind of interaction.
Very much so.
Yeah, and it reminds me, because it was a kind of a key principle that many of your colleagues have repeated to me when it comes to, combating, say, shadow AI or shadow cloud, whatever it is. We're always battling with people now can bring in their own things. Make it easy for them to do things the right way, and you won't even have to fight the other things. Although I assume you can turn off access to a switch locally and some other things like this that would be part of operationalizing it. But just, make it easy to do the right thing, and then the wrong things should reduce.
Very much so, yeah. And it's, even that middle ground of we're going to allow manual change today, and but tonight at 2 a.m. on a compliance run, we're going to put it back to what was defined in the source of truth, right? That can be a little disruptive from, a fix going in and something being broken again the next day, potentially. We want to get to the idea that no one is making manual change to any piece of infrastructure, right? We update the data, and the data flows down and through via automation to run on that device. And, that is a key driver in reducing risk and taking human error out of it, and doing this because when we have the data modeled correctly, when we're wrapping it with data validation and automated testing and automation to drive that change, we really can get to the point that from an organizational standpoint, the ability to make change really at all hours of the day starts to become streamlined because it's well tested. It's, running in an automated fashion, and there's no chance, I wish I could say no chance, but a reduced chance for human error. Right. Yeah. And now all of a sudden we can give people what they want when they want it. And that, I think, is a huge benefit because longer term, right, although someone's operational job may change, they don't log into switches or routers to make change manually. they can focus on the things that matter and the
Yeah.
work that should be done versus fighting fires and dealing with a lot of that day-to-day type of ticket work that we do a lot of workshops and we get that collective groan of here's the thing I hate doing all the time because it comes across my inbox 200 300 times a
Yeah.
week.
Especially as I feel like every person, at least that I've interacted with in some similar situation, you always kind of know that the ticket you're responding to or the thing you're working on, although it may be different from the thing you worked on before, you can kind of tell those things that are like, I'm just doing something and it's a point in time. I'm going to have to do this again because we could sense or feel the underlying root causes have not been addressed as to why this keeps happening. And that's frustrating for the individuals because this does take, and this is really where I would think Worldwide comes in, is it does take coordination among different people to have those arguments, but have those discussions in advance about, well, what's our golden source of, how do we define success? How do we define what this is supposed to look like so that we could put in the tools to constantly tell us if we're still on that path or if it's been changed, and how automated are we in even kind of reestablishing that baseline.
Yeah,
But,
and I think the other beauty of that is outside of just having a good, consistent configuration. We work with a lot of clients that are highly regulated, and so being able to report back that the state of your infrastructure is what you said it's going to be, right? You can have a audit finding wrapped around being able to prove that your infrastructure is in a known good state and that it's compliant and that your security baselines are applied across the entirety of the infrastructure, right? That alone is a huge time savings, right? Outside of just day-to-day configuration change. But,
Yeah.
if someone's got to report back with the findings that they've been asked to go capture, you can very quickly run a report and provide the data to someone versus going and creating that manually. That's a huge change as well.
Well, what a mind shift, right? Because now, at least maybe this is just me, but there's certain things people ask me for, and I'm like, I'm groaning because I know that there's a lot of work involved in putting it together. I'm curious, where do people generally start with this type of thing?
As an old network engineer, there is nothing without the network, I would say. So it's always the right place to start. There is no application without a network to ride on top of, right? And so we really do, nearly every time start with the network. And then it grows from there. Once we've modeled and adopted these principles for the network, we can start to lay down how is where is the compute plugged in? What's the expected behavior of the servers? Where is the storage at? We start to kind of layer on top of it, right?
Yeah.
But fundamentally, I would say 10 out of 10 times we're starting these efforts at the network level first. But, it is core to the way that we work with, all things in a client. And, as even now we're working with clients on, they're building large scale facilities to support their own private AI work. And fundamental to being able to deliver those facilities and the AI workloads in the way that their consumers are expecting them, we're building these solutions under the covers to support that end to end as well. It's got application, across the board, but I would say we always start with the network and layer it on from there.
Have you seen, because you've been working on automation quite in a focused manner, through this whole growth of generative LLMs and generative AI, has there been any confusion between AI thinking that has solved automation problems, perhaps? Or what are you seeing in clients? Has anything shifted there that's important to cover?
We always like to say there's no AI without automation. As you're starting to...
One precedes the other.
Yeah, as you're starting to build and scale infrastructure at the scale required to run these AI workloads, having a solid foundation of automation under the covers is extremely important. There's also a benefit of being able to leverage AI to help streamline some of these processes as well, right? Having access to code generation and some of the capabilities that LLMs can bring to bear. And then even some of the, I would say newer, more really exciting things from model context protocol and being able to ask questions of your source of truth with AI and, have an operational person, ask a real world question in plain English and get that answer back, without having to understand that I'm looking in this system and it's, validating data from over here and it's pulling from 3 or 4, systems under the covers. There's a lot of value in that. And I think it's still a little early in that stage, but we're going to see more and more really interesting use cases with that come up in the next, 3 to 6 months, I would imagine.
Well, the one common thread I love, no matter what our topic, it feels like, we talked about automation today, but we've done we got shows on governance, shows, of course, on AI, cybersecurity, compliance. Everything tends to come back to good data. The one common refrain I've seen for anyone saying, obviously AI is in our future. And, and I think we're probably moving in a direction where we won't think of it as much as AI because it just becomes part of how we do business. But none of that is going to work well if you don't have a good understanding of your data and you have trust and you can rely on it as being what it is and where it goes and how it should be contextualized, I guess. Because you're going to run into that problem both with automation, you're going to run into that problem with AI. Is that, you agree?
Yeah, I would 100% agree. And I think especially, when we see some of the kind of more natural language interfaces into some of this data as well, right? If someone who may not have the background of how something is built, right, and they're asking questions of this data, if you're providing them a false answer that looks, truthful,
that looks good,
and they run with it, that could cause problems as well. So that data hygiene side of making sure that the data that we're querying with AI is solid and, vetted and clean and continually cared for, I think is extremely important and will become more and more important down the line. But I do think it's going to be really interesting because I think we're going to open up a lot of opportunities for people to troubleshoot, make change, maybe longer term start to even make and affect change in their infrastructure in a more natural manner versus having to truly understand how the entire system is built under the covers.
I'm curious when you speak to leaders and you speak to those CIOs and above, perhaps, if there's any common misunderstandings that you wish you didn't have to readdress so often. It seems even more clear now that data becomes your competitive differentiator in a lot of situations. And that if we don't, no matter what industry you're in, if you don't have a full understanding of the data that you have under your control and how you're leveraging that successfully in many different ways, well beyond just automation, perhaps. Do leaders understand this? Do they understand what's required of automation?
I would say in the last 1.5 to 2 years, there's been a pivot where it's becoming more apparent to everybody how important this is, especially, when we look at kind of overall this priority from a source of truth standpoint. Again, its core kind of existence is focused on documentation, right? Documenting the infrastructure, the assets that are in that infrastructure, having a good operational picture of what you have in your environment and where it is and how it's connected. And one of the, I think biggest struggles that we have, and it's, and you'll have this conversation, in the future as it relates to priority 2, but that life cycle management part of what's where, is it due for refresh? Did it get decommissioned correctly? That is so important and so tightly coupled with having this part of it done that we're starting to really see that these two priorities are going in lockstep because, the other one enables a more seamless source of truth, and a source of truth is a good source of input data for that second priority as well, to make sure that we're able to give the leadership side a view of what's in their infrastructure, what state is it in, all of the information that they care about, because again, they don't care as much about is BGP enabled on my WAN, that's not something that they're going to be interested in. But what they are going to care about is that, is my WAN fully modeled? Do I know where all of my devices are? Is everything in a known good state with support? And are we running current software? And do we have, security vulnerabilities patched? All of those questions that they care about can be answered by having this data in a central source of truth and being curated and making sure that it's up to date. So it's really about, I would say, using it as a central point to provide the business the answers to the questions that they're asking that are less technical but more fundamental to just security and the overall operation of the business as a whole.
I'm always impressed with the range of options available from light, stick your toe in, to fully immersed, let's bring in the whole team. But what do you suggest next steps?
Yeah, so I think there's a few ways to look at it. A solid source of truth is core to how we deliver nearly all of our automation engagements. So for us, it's baked into how we just go to market and help our clients solve automation challenges. But there's a lot of things that go into it, right? for organizations that maybe haven't used one before, have no hands-on experience, we have learning paths with, hands-on environments that people can go launch on demand and be able to kick the tires on some of these tools and understand what it means to model the data and drive network automation out of it. So being able to learn and upskill, obviously, first and foremost, helps kind of, I would say, alleviate some of the potential fears for someone as far as what does this mean for my day-to-day as I start to move down this new model. The next part of it is really when we look at how we work with our clients, it's, from that front end consulting and kind of analysis phase of being able to understand what is the right source of truth for their environment. What are the data sources that we need to pull the data from that are going to be important? Do they have one already? A lot of times we even find, because a lot of the tools that we use, they're open source and there's teams that have, deployed them for free. Do they have one somewhere? And what are their behaviors around that? And how do we, take what that team may be doing on their own and up-level it into an enterprise capability? And then, from there, how do we start to deliver the outcomes that the source of truth can provide and deliver the automation, coming from that source of truth to start to drive, ongoing configuration compliance and, infrastructure automation at scale. And, through the entire life cycle, that's as a business, what we're here to help our clients do. And then, the beauty of it is that for us, in the time that we've been in business, just from an automation standpoint, we're helping our other kind of traditional services businesses, the data center refreshes, the branch network refreshes, up-level, up-level how they're delivering, because as part of those large-scale refresh programs or delivery engagements that they're doing, we're now starting to do a lot of work where along the way, we're delivering to the client that large refresh with a source of truth, with the automation, so that on the tail end of it, they're not just getting, a refresh for, the sake of a refresh, but they're actually on the output side of that getting a fully automated network backed by a source of truth with this kind of new operational model along with it. And it's a great way to, get clients towards that model and do it as part of a, larger compelling event versus, just coming in and looking at it directly as a standalone program as well.
We started today's conversation with a critical question. Could a lack of clarity in your IT infrastructure be the hidden bottleneck in your automation efforts? Well, as Nick Thompson explained, the answer is a resounding yes. Establishing a robust source of truth isn't just about good record keeping. It's the bedrock upon which successful automation and all of its promised benefits of reduced risk, increased consistency, and faster deployments, all that is built on this stuff. A reliable source of truth gives your teams the confidence that they need to automate effectively, eliminating the drift and inconsistencies that plague so many organizations. Don't let a shaky foundation undermine your automation goals. Download the Automation Priorities for 2025 research paper from Worldwide Technology's website and learn all 4 priorities that can elevate your automation strategy, starting with building that essential single source of truth. I'm Rob Boyd. We'll see you again next time.
This episode is supported by WEC.io. WEC.io offers high-performance, scalable file storage solutions optimized for demanding applications. Accelerate your workloads with WEC.io's modern storage platform.